This is Mike Harris. This is the short end of the stick. Today is July 26, 2020, and our guest today is Dr. Stephen Greer. Stephen, welcome to the show, sir. It is very, very nice to meet you for the first time.
Nice to meet you. Thank you.
And before we start, I have to acknowledge our mutual common friend, Dr. Carol Rosen, who is a dear friend and was a neighbor of mine when I resided in Ashland, Oregon. And I have spent many, many hours with her discussing everything from weapons in space to ET contact. So I have to sort of tip my hand a little bit that way and give her the acknowledgement that she deserves right from the get-go.
Yeah, well, Carol and I met over 20 years ago and was one of our early disclosure project witnesses, as you know, who, of course, she had worked with Wernher von Braun and had been warned of this hoaxing of a off-planet alien threat, which I had heard from other sources during the period. I began briefing people like the director of the CIA and others in 1993 on this problem. And so we eventually got networked together, and I wasn't surprised when she told me what she had learned from the father of modern rocketry, Wernher von Braun, who invented the V-2 rocket for Adolf Hitler, that in fact, that in the aerospace covert operations, that they had the means to hoax and to eventually roll out sort of a false flag alien threat. And in fact, now if you look at like what happened in the last 24 or 48 hours on the New York Times and CNN and Fox and other major networks, they have more information coming out about the Pentagon's secret programs dealing with this. But the sub rosa narrative of every one of those mainstream news stories is that it's a national security threat, which is even Senator Marco Rubio recently said that last week on the news. And this is something we had predicted almost 30 years ago when I first started this project in 1990. And the big risk that we're facing right now is that the disclosure of the UFO matter is going to get spun by the spinmeisters who are, wrap themselves falsely in the flag patriotism and national security, when in reality, they are people trying to seize control globally through fear. And that's really what that agenda is about. I've never met with anyone in senior national security, CIA, aerospace contractors who at all think that these civilizations are hostile or a threat. But that's what always comes out through the mainstream media, because that's what's going to enrich the people who like using our heroic men and women in armed forces as cannon fodder. And they really, they pretend to care about our soldiers. They actually don't. They view them as pawns to be played on a geopolitical power play. And that's unfortunately what's going on this subject. So what I'm trying to do is to put out factual information, but in a way that doesn't panic the public and put the public on this war footing, which of course the next, with the creation of the Space Force, there's this tendency to say, well, our next theater of operations for battles has to be space. And of course, there couldn't be anything more reckless and dangerous than that. And that's going forward, unfortunately, very quickly right now.
Well, let me discuss a couple of things. I mean, you and I are of the same generation. We grew up in the, we're kids in the late 50s, early 60s, and those were our formative years. And I remember being in kindergarten and grade school and being forced to hide under my desk because of the unlikely event that a nuclear bomb was going to go off and my desk was going to protect me.
Yes.
But what they were doing was instilling fear in us.
Mm-hmm.
And as an adult, I am tired of being afraid. That game doesn't work on me.
Right.
I mean, I'm not afraid of dying. I don't want it to hurt, but I'm not afraid of dying.
Right.
This old BS story that you have to be afraid of something or someone, and there's some boogeyman out there that's going to get us is nonsense. And
right.
I've traveled to the former Soviet Union, and I've met these people over there, And what astounded me the most is how much like us they are. I
Sure.
mean, I remember being in Ukraine and being in parts of Russia, and I'm meeting with Russian men and women of my generation. They're just like us. They just speak a different language and have a little bit different culture. And this old fear mantra,
Yes.
it's a failed mantra. It doesn't work. And
Right.
so my mission here on this interview with you today is to try to increase the audience and try to get people who are afraid of living in fear and to embrace the new way going forward by expanding consciousness and to expand the amount of humanity, that critical 1% you reference in your movie, that can make the difference and shift the collective consciousness into something that is more proactive, because the criminals who run our planet need to be put in check.
Yeah, they do, and they're not going to be put in check by the political establishment, because those people either are part of the problem or they don't have the power to do it. Now, the people do. One of the things I point out, and we just released in April a 2-hour feature film called Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind, and that is a documentary that goes through how they and what their agenda is with these disclosures coming from the Pentagon about UFOs, which they have now relabeled UAPs. Of course, they're neither. There are two types of objects out there people are seeing. One are extraterrestrial vehicles, which the people inside the system at the NSA and elsewhere call them ETVs, extraterrestrial vehicles. The other are devices that have been made by our classified aerospace engineering programs at Lockheed Skunk Works. My uncle's old company was Northrop Grumman. And they have things that look like UFOs that are man-made, because surprisingly, in 1954, October 1954, we had mastered gravity control through very classified research. I have a man at the Naval Research Labs who is the highest ranking scientist there, who was in the vault, saw the documentation that was the date where we actually mastered gravity control. It had been experimented with in the late 20s, 30s, 40s, but by 1954 it was operational. So many of these objects, like the Tic Tac, as they call it, that our Navy fighter jets were chasing off the coast of California, those very likely are from the Lockheed Palmdale Skunk Works facility. And I know men who worked on those devices and have been testing them for quite a few decades. So unfortunately, the way they're spinning the story to people like Senator Rubio and others and to the media is that these objects are, quote, violating our airspace and are a threat to our national security. And that's how you get more and more money for the warmongers and the profiteers. But it's also how you control the populace. And I think the only thing the thing that concerns me most is that, there's that old song from the 70s from The Who that says, "We won't be fooled again." But we are.
Meet the new boss, same as the old boss.
Yeah, the new boss saying it's the old boss. It's a classic old rock song. But I tell people we have been fooled again. I mean, we went into Iraq based on completely confabulated weapon of mass destruction evidence that Saddam Hussein had, which was completely false. And of course, a couple $1 trillion later, and God knows how many hundreds of thousands of people dead and injured, both American and the Middle Eastern people. It came out, of course, that he had no such weapons, and the whole thing was a complete fraud perpetrated on the Congress, the UN, and the American public. So I think that we need to begin to understand that we really have to independently fact check the truth. But as you know, in Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind, this new, which by the way you can see on iTunes and Amazon and other sites, that documentary, we have a great interview with Daniel Sheehan, who was worked on the Pentagon Papers representing the New York Times. He was a Harvard Law Review guy who got involved in that back in the 70s. And he saw documents related to Project Mockingbird, where the intelligence community had the top national security editors at all the media in the world on dual payroll. So they were getting a paycheck from, say, the New York Times or the Washington Post, and they were also clandestinely an agent of the CIA, and they would change and alter stories as needed. Now, this attorney thought this was a very big news story, but of course, the foxes are guarding the hen house, and they wouldn't cover it. So when people look at this documentary, what we try to do in Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind is take people from, here's the situation today and why it's this way, and here's how we fix it. And we fix it by the masses and the public awakening to their own innate capabilities and consciousness, and take the procedures for making contact directly to these interstellar civilizations and just bypass the entire governmental military system. And that is what I have been doing since 1990. First, very in a small way. Now we have around 100,000 people globally doing this. We call it CE5 for Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind protocols. And in fact, there's a new app you can get for your smartphone that's called the CE5 Contact app. The CE5 Contact is actually a whole training process for consciousness, meditation, what the CIA used to call remote viewing, where you use awareness to see remote places, how to set up these teams, et cetera, and so on. So that app is sort of a instructive thing. So, and it also has a messaging system, so that if you're in Phoenix and there's like 20 other people nearby who are interested in this, you can link up with them and form a basically an interplanetary diplomatic team that is civilian, granted, who have no official standing, but that's civilian, that can interact with these civilizations to create a rapprochement and a communication and a peaceful dialogue, as opposed to a conflict-oriented relationship, which is, of course, what the covert programs are attempting to do.
Well, one thing I don't understand, and
Yes.
My undergraduate studies were in applied physics, particularly solid state physics, material science.
Mm-hmm.
I have an MBA in finance. Okay, and so what I don't understand with the arms producers, the Lockheed Martins, the Northrop Grumman, the Raytheons, what I don't get is the potential to retool everything you do and direct it toward both interplanetary and interstellar exploration. The risk reward benefit is so much greater than if we sit on this planet and try to bomb each other and try to gain dominance over this zero-sum game. There's more wealth in the asteroid belt waiting to be mined than this planet will produce in 25 lifetimes.
Right.
What is the holdback? Why don't they want to let go of the destructive model and embrace the exploration model? I don't understand it.
Because the fear and destructive model is how you control mass populations. So now we have to go look at the tribalistic roots in human consciousness and the bioevolutionary roots of why we break into tribes and fight each other for thousands of years. That these operatives in covert programs, and pretty much the central committee that deals with this is called the MAJIC, M-A-J-I-C. It stands for Majority Intelligence Committee. I have a National Reconnaissance Office, which is the top secret entity that runs all the spy satellites, document that names that entity along with a number of others. And what they're trying to do is create global control and a global international or transnational control over the population by exploiting people's tendencies to fear otherness. So, it's just like, Hitler knew how to exploit anti-Semitism. The KKK knows how to exploit racism. Demagogues of all stripes, but this is the big one. So the big one is, how do you get humans to be united, not around something beautiful or enlightened or exploratory, as you're pointing out, but around something that's another enemy, because then they can control the narrative. So it's really about global domination and control, much more than it is about any rational decision in terms of resources, assets, and money. you know, money at the level that they're dealing with, which is in the trillions of dollars. You know, I mean, even Rumsfeld, the day before 9/11, admitted that there were $2.3 trillion unaccounted for in the Department of Defense budget. So trillion with a T. So
well, I know, I remember the announcement on September 10th, the day before 9/11.
yes,
Remember
yep.
it quite well, and that's when the speculation that there truly is another secret space program out there that they haven't informed us about. So
Well, and of course, those technologies, as I mentioned, have been operational in their early form since the early 50s. And what the problem is, you have to look at what the long-term agenda is for these kinds of very entrenched power centers. They want us to go from international conflict to, you know, it's like that movie, that old movie with Will Smith, Independence Day,
yes,
where the whole, and that was written at CIA central scripting right there, where basically the narrative was the whole world of even competing, you know, Jewish and Arab and unite against the alien threat. And Will Smith goes, yeah, let's go kick alien butt. Well, of course, that makes for a great science fiction movie, perhaps, but in reality, that's sort of a peek into Hollywood is often a peek into the scripting from the intelligence community with their psychological warfare and counterintelligence efforts. So anyone who's worked in counterintelligence and psyops understands that you do this in ways that are not clumsy. It's work through pop culture. It's work through narratives that are embedded. For example, the Pentagon coming out with this so-called Tic Tac objects we were chasing, and that footage, or the recent revelation 2 days ago where it was said that there are material that we've studied from, quote, not of this world. And that was in all the mainstream media, but the narrative that was subtly attached to it was always in the article or in the story that it's a national security threat. So that is how they want to begin to condition human consciousness towards their long-term plan of uniting people, not in a peaceful way or in a hopeful way or in a enlightened way, but in a way that's centered around fear, adversaries, conflict. Because demagogues, whether it's religious fanatics or political people or empires, have always used conflict and putting one per entity against another entity to create conflict, because in that conflict they can then control the society. And we have to awaken to the fact that that is the manipulation that's going on. I mean, I think that is one of the big tasks of someone breathing the free air of Earth, whether they're in China, Russia, the United States, Great Britain, doesn't matter, is that they have to awaken that that is the agenda. And the only way they can pull it off is that we kind of go along with the brainwashing.
Well, that brainwashing has been going on for, as you said, decades. How many alien invasion movies have we seen? You mentioned Independence Day, there's Battle for LA. All of these things precondition us to accept these things. Right. Another example with this COVID precondition, we had the movie Outbreak, Pandemic, you know, all these things where these viruses get out and they get loose. Now everybody's running around with a mask on like a bunch of idiots when there's no real reason to do it. This is how they work. This is how they condition us to accept things that we would normally say not no, but hell no to. And so they work on us, and they work on us 20, 30 years in advance. Right. So that, you know, there's whole generations that grow up believing nothing but the narrative that they have already imposed before it is even sprung on the public.
Yeah, someone accused me once of being Morpheus, giving people the red pill. But
I'll take that as a compliment.
But or whatever. But you know, my view of it is that this is why the Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind, that the really central thesis of it is a deep dive into what the science of consciousness involves. That the mind, not our individual ego, but the mind itself, is a conscious field that isn't limited by space or time, and that this has been proven in physics studies, and that can be used to not only intuit and see with consciousness remote places. But it's interesting that these interstellar civilizations, that in order to go from, say, one galaxy or star system to another, they can't go at the speed of light because it would take thousands and thousands or millions of years. They're going through dimensions, through very high voltage. We can get into the physics of this. Very VHV, very high voltage systems at certain resonant frequencies that create a vector into these other dimensions that are not limited by Newtonian physics or even Einsteinian physics, because you're now in another dimension. So they shift from 3D into other dimensions and appear at another point in 3D, not after 1,000 years at the speed of light, but in a matter of moments or a week or whatever. So these technologies have been studied since the 40s and 50s. We understand them very well. I'm not going to bore your audience with the arcana of it. You'd probably be more interested if you have a physics background. But what we do know is that humans, because of our innate abilities, you don't have to have these technologies, can go into a meditative state and experience the quiet aspect of consciousness and connect to the aspect of consciousness that's not limited by space and time. Well, when you do that, and that's all the meditative state does in its simplest form, you can then awaken to see, and also with thought, communicate with the electronics, trans-dimensional electronics that these extraterrestrial civilizations have. So they have devices that might look similar to an iPhone or a smartphone or a little black oblong box that connects directly to thought and can go from point to point at the speed of thought. Well, now people always ask, what's the speed of thought? It is instantaneous, because it is propagating through the field of consciousness that isn't in the Newtonian or Einsteinian universe of the limits of the speed of electromagnetic signals, which is 186,000 miles a second. So it's instant. It's absolutely instant. And so these civilizations, which are, you know, obviously a few 100,000, some a few million years more advanced than we are, they have technologies sort of like what Elon Musk is working on right now. He has a company called Neuralink. And by 2025, he wants to have a technology so you can think to your computer and it does what you're thinking without any wires. And now, of course, he's studied this stuff and he understands that that's possible. What I'm telling people is these civilizations that we're seeing out here, when we do our CE5 contact app protocols, those have mastered that science for millennia. It's like you and me flipping on a light switch for them to interface with consciousness or thought. And it's, you know, a lot of people think that's extremely out there, kind of wild ideas. I said, no, this was, you know, Russell Targ, who was a physicist with Lockheed, who was a laser physicist, who was part of the CIA remote viewing group that began, and he was for 23 years, from the 70s into the 90s, working with a whole group of people using consciousness to remote view and see behind the Iron Curtain what the Soviets were doing, what the Chinese were doing. And they had great accuracy. And he's actually in this documentary, Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind. He's elderly now, but very, very smart, very sharp, understands this very well. And so what I tell people, I said, that's what was doing low tech, just with what people can innately do with their consciousness. But now let's extrapolate past what Elon Musk wants to do 100,000, 200,000, a million years into the future. You're dealing with civilizations that seamlessly have the ability to interface with conscious fields as easily as we send electromagnetic signals around the globe with cell phones or satellites or what have you. So we have to begin to understand the new paradigm, which is a paradigm of conscious intelligence and the science of consciousness, which actually began to be studied and understood, 50, 60 years ago scientifically, but it's all been sort of kept quiet. And of course, then the mainstream media ridicules it as sort of psychic hoo-ha and what have you. But it's actually, I can tell you, at the people at the CIA and intelligence community at the Pentagon take it extremely seriously. And by the way, so does the Secret Service in terms of protecting the president and other assets. I know that for a personal fact. because I've been involved with that. And I think that people need to understand that these civilizations are universally non-hostile. But, and here's the big caveat, because I'm not a Pollyanna person. I'm not a trauma doctor, you know, shooting, stabbings, all the fun stuff. They're extremely displeased and worried about humans. We cross the nuclear threshold, then we cross shortly after that into the space, occupying space, going into space. And we haven't become civilized, meaning that a level 1 civilization that Michio Kaku talks about would be a civilization that is at least not fighting and has become peaceful. Even if there's disagreements, you're not doing it at the level of destruction and weapons of mass destruction. We haven't gone from that level of a destructive, self-destructive, dangerous species to a peaceful one, but our technologies have kept accelerating. And whatever people think they know about that's reported in scientific journals or CNN or what have you, is not even 1% of what exists technologically in classified projects that I've been read into and have been at facilities and seen. So my concern about that is that you have some of the worst sociopaths in human history possessing some of the most advanced technologies you can imagine, teleportation, et cetera, and so on. But they intend to use it for all kinds of corrupt reasons to control the masses. So the disclosure of this information, which for many people seems kind of out there and sort of, you know, with all the rioting going on and coronavirus and the economic collapse, who cares? Well, you better care about this, because this is a 10 times bigger problem than COVID and all the other issues that people are focusing on.
Well, they've indicated a willingness to exterminate 90% of the human population on the planet so they can maintain their control grid.
Yes.
That should concern everyone alive.
Yeah.
Because it's my belief that they're very sincere about this and that
they are.
wish to move forward with it. And, you know, I go back to the work of Maxwell,
yes.
early 1900, 1910.
Yes.
If you understand Maxwell's work,
yes,
anti-gravity is a component of that work.
Yep.
What we would call free energy is a component of that work.
Yes.
Ergo, that work had to be suppressed into perpetuity so they could maintain their monopoly on energy and the oil and the fossil fuels and all the things that are fund all of their earthly activities. Because if you eliminated the tax that you know, electricity and other power sources are on you, their power structure falls apart overnight.
Yes.
I mean, it's done. It's over. Once mankind has access to these things. And so it's sort of incumbent upon the rest of us to ensure that these things become readily available to all of mankind so that we can destroy the power base that the sociopaths, the psychopaths are operating out of.
Well, and what's interesting is that the key to that, it's sort of an integrated strategy that I've been working for about 30 years. I transitioned out of medicine a few years ago just to focus on this problem. And now I'm, you know, an old dude. I'm 65, so I just sort of like, this is my whole focus. I'm 65 going on 18 because I still bench press 410 pounds and leg press 900. I'm a outrageous person. Anyway, so Carol Rosen gets a kick out of, you know, I'm sort of like this wild man. But what is interesting is that these people understand that what you just said is 100% true. And on top of it, think about it for a moment. The entire reserve currency of the world is the petrodollar. This was from Bretton Woods after World War II. So what has happened, if you understand finance and global economic, is that these technologies coming out, which would make oil completely unnecessary except for plastics and synthetics.
It becomes a lubricant. Yeah.
It's a lubricant or the base material to make a plastic cup or something, which is of dubious value. But I think that what we have to understand is that the entire operating system financially, technologically of the planet, which could have been changed by Maxwell or Tesla. You know, J.P. Morgan famously told Nikola Tesla, Yeah, because he had a car with a little antenna on it that was running off this energy field. Is that if I can't, JP Morgan said, if I can't put a meter on it, it's not going to come out. Now, so that's 100 years ago. Now let's fast forward to now. The same kind of, I call them petro-Nazis and oligarchs and big financial, and we're not talking billions, we're talking hundreds or $1,000 trillion in assets here in terms of financial and oil and utility grid and transmission lines, internal combustion engines, rockets, jets, car, and all of it. It's all obsolete. Now, that is like the biggest economic revolution. It would dwarf the Industrial Revolution by an orders of magnitude. But if we don't do it, we're going to destroy the biosphere and billions of people. If we do it now, we've got to figure out how to do it to phase it in so that we don't have a complete economic collapse. So this is it's one of the horns of a dilemma, because these madmen push this issue so far. And I understand this is why when Eisenhower, who did have a meeting with ETs near Muroc, which is where Edwards is, near where Edwards Air Force Base is now, in I believe it was 56, they wanted us to make this change, not only in terms of weapons of mass destruction and peace in space and all of that, but the cabal of sociopaths who had already embedded themselves in the CIA, which was formed in 47 after the Roswell crash, and had literally that same summer. And the Air Force was taken off from the Army Air Force at the same time also. That whole part of history most people don't know, but it was because Eisenhower really wanted to make a change. But the people who he later, when he left office, called the military industrial complex, did not. And it became a problem to where one of Eisenhower's aides, who was a young Army officer in the White House Signal Corps back in 1959-60, has been on our team. He's since passed away, but he told us, and I have his videotape on our YouTube channel, it stated very directly that Eisenhower was very upset because he had been pushed out of the oversight of those groups working on these technologies in the 50s, because he wasn't willing to go along with this, quite frankly, fascist agenda of this secrecy. And a lot of people don't know this story. I'm friends with Senator John Warner, who was the senior Republican senator from here, from my state of Virginia, and had been Secretary of the Navy back in the 70s, I believe. And his son is someone I've met with extensively. And it's interesting, a lot of people don't know this, but Senator John Warner, in addition to having been married to Elizabeth Taylor later, was originally married to Paul Mellon's daughter. Paul Mellon, at the end of World War II, was one of the few people who was a true billionaire, but he was a big Hitler supporter. And so was Dulles, who started the CIA, and so was, of course, Watson of IBM and Ford and a lot of other industrialists. But at the end of the war, those guys reemerged and pulled into our national security structure and our early aerospace program and intelligence committee and the newly founded CIA in 47, basically this agenda. So this is actually, a lot of these problems were continued after World War II through clandestine operations, which actually betrayed Eisenhower, who was a five-star general. And a lot of people don't understand how a five-star general like Eisenhower would say, of this warning in his last address to the world of the military-industrial complex. He wasn't anti-military. He was the military's military man. However, he had seen personally, and he was very bitter about this, I know this from people who knew him very personally, that he was very bitter that he had been shoved aside and lost control over these, what are called now unacknowledged special access projects, really black projects.
Well, let me interject a data point here, because the CIA, the OSS existed before the CIA. After
Right.
World War II, they incorporated the Nazis' Gehlen organization into the CIA, and that became their primary intelligence gathering network for all of Eastern Europe and what was then the Soviet Union. So
Correct.
that was the foundation of the CIA. In addition to which, our friend Carol, who used to work for Werner von Braun, brought his cadre of Nazi scientists into NASA. And so you have these two very strong, very powerful Nazi elements that were welcomed into the US government and have since proliferated throughout the US government and results in what we call the deep state today.
Right.
And we're still seeing repercussions. I mean, it doesn't matter who we put in office, they still work for those guys.
Correct.
You know, it's they don't work for the American people. Our concept of a republic is outdated, and we need to either update our concept or we need to put it back to restore it to its original. So we've got a handful of issues here where these entrenched interests are preventing us from evolving and moving toward that Star Trek type civilization that we were envisioning back in the early 60s. So, I mean, you and I are the same age. I remember when man landed on the moon, and I thought to myself, by golly, I'll be on Mars by the time I'm 40. And they
Right.
dropped the ball. They dropped the ball. And, you know, here I am, 65. I've never gotten there yet, you know, so I'm a little disappointed with that. So.
And the reason for that isn't that technologically we couldn't do it. We could. It's that the technologies that would be most practical to achieve that goal would pull the curtain back on what's called quantum vacuum, zero-point energy systems, and EMGs, electromagnetic-gravitic systems. Pop culture calls it anti-gravity. It's not anti-gravity. It has to do with very high voltage systems that cause an alteration in the mass of literally every atom in an object through spin. And anyway, it's a very complex but understandable set of equations in physics. But I have personally worked with people who have built these devices and flown them. And so by the time, you know, my uncle was at Grumman, became Northrop Grumman as an aerospace engineer, and he worked on the lunar module, which landed on the moon 51 years ago this past week. And I remember watching that moon landing and, you know, thinking, oh my, this is amazing. Little did I know at age 14 that in 1969, that was 15 years after we had mastered gravity control and had covert objects that could move without any regard to gravity, gravitational field, or mass inertia effect. So if you look at your velocity equations, velocity is inversely proportional to mass. But if you look at that equation, if mass goes to zero, velocity can go to infinity.
Well,
that's what we're talking about. When you reach
go ahead.
When you reach zero mass, that's when people see these UFOs that literally dematerialize in front of you. And the next thing you know, they're 50 miles over here. And we have people on my team who have been military and civilian radar operators who've seen that. My team that's gone out and made contact with these civilizations have seen it. So I tell people that it's a whole new science and physics, but it isn't new. It started evolving, as you mentioned, at the turn of the last century, late 1800s, early 1900s. A lot of people don't know that the RAND Corporation, it got founded based on the work of T. Townsend Brown, who in the 20s was using very high voltage systems to cause levitation effect. And that was reproduced by the Kolosky-Frost experiment in 1928-29 in Germany. So people think that, you know, I think my next movie is going to be, I'm going to do something on what I call the lost century. That there's a century of lost human evolution, progress, abundance, all the pollution and problem we see in the world from petrochemicals, oil, gas, coal, the oceans, all that's fixable and all of it's been unnecessary. But the problem is in the human social dynamic and spiritual dynamic. Because if with these technologies you and I are referring to right now come out and they're wielded by sociopaths who want to use them as weapons, that's the end of the world as we know it. So it's a double-edged sword. And I say as a medical doctor, you can use that knife to put butter on your bread, or you can use it to stab that person through the left ventricle of the heart. I've seen both. So if these technologies don't come out in a civilization that has a higher consciousness and where there is a higher sense of moral, ethical, and I don't mean moral like who you're having sex with, I mean real morality, whether or not we do things with integrity and whether we do things that are harmful to our fellow man, unless those technology come out within an ethical construct of a more enlightened consciousness, they will be adopted immediately and adapted immediately as a weapon system. So this is why conscious evolution and the development of consciousness and higher states of consciousness has to accompany the release of the technologies. And frankly, we're getting a little long in the tooth to get that transition in effect just because of the rate of decay of the biosphere and the geopolitical exigencies that are pressing.
Well, let me give two examples, because I think people need to understand examples that are concrete in front of them, where actually these anti-gravitics are being used. If you look at the B-2 bomber itself, you look at the amount of thrust it produces, you look at the amount of wing space it has, it carries a payload that is unexplainable by those two factors. Correct. Its payload is much greater than what it should be able to carry using Newtonian physics. Correct. And so if anybody wants to do the math on this, they can figure it out. It's there, it's right in front of your nose. Yep. Go look it up. Yep. And so there is one concrete example that is being used by the US military today. Something that people they've documented it, they've seen the B-2 bombers, they know what they look like. That's real life.
Well, so, and of course, I know the people who worked on that. Mm-hmm. And they don't like me to say what I'm about to say, but on the leading edge and the trailing edge of the wings, there's a very high voltage electromagnetic system that they can switch on that causes this cavitation bubble that moves the air out of the way. It basically reduces the coefficient of drag of the air resistance, but also causes this anti-gravity lift. And I know the men who actually worked on that system in developing the B-2 stealth, and this has been described to me in some detail. Interestingly, that same system could be put on conventional cars and trucks going down the highway, and they get 20–30% more fuel efficiency because there would be no wind drag. And they wouldn't all have to look like a round Toyota Prius thing. They could be any shape. Of course, the other part of that, this is another part of the weird, at the CIA, they call this stuff WSFM. It sounds like a radio station. It stands for Weird Science and Frickin' Magic. But at my uncle's company, Northrop Grumman, they just call it PFM, Pure Effin' Magic. But he basically would make those vehicles invisible to radar. And that's another part of the stealth part of the B-2 stealth, is that this electromagnetic signal renders it not visible, reflective to radars, conventional radar.
No, but I think it's important for people to have a concrete example, something they know about, something they see exists, and be able to do the math themselves to say, well, yes, there is, that gives, it validates everything we're saying right here, because it is deployed currently.
Yep, and you can go to any air show and see them. Yeah,
that's right, they're there.
They're just not telling the people how it's doing what it's doing, that's all.
Okay, well, I think we're at a critical nexus in time here, and I look what's going on politically, domestically. I look at what's going on throughout our entire financial system. There's so much debt, it could never be repaid. We've got to do some spiritual evolution and some spiritual growth here, so that we don't go into another 1,000-year dark ages, because that's where the bad guys want to take us. They want us back in that box.
They do.
And if we don't want to go in that box, we as humanity, as the human collective, if you will, collective of individuals, we have to assert our will and reach out spiritually to each other, and then maybe off planet, our stellar neighborhood here to others who may be able to assist us in our quest to get out of this, because the Dark Ages were a very terrible time, and that's where the bad guys want to take us back to. So what is your advice on that? What is your take? How do we crawl? How do we walk? Then how do we run? What's our path?
Well, I think the path, one of the central points we make in this movie, Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind, is that studies have been done for decades in quantum physics that shows that, this is a very concrete example, then I will apply it to the world condition, is that if you take, for example, helium and cool it down to absolute zero, minus 200 and whatever it is, degrees, Kelvin, you get to a point where that container of helium, as it begins to get extremely, the molecules begin to align coherently, and this coherence, this field coherence, as it's called, in the container of helium, once it approaches 1% of the molecules, or atoms in this case, same thing for helium, you have what's called a phase transition. And that phase transition, of course, right before there is this field of coherence that propagates, at that 1% of molecules, everything becomes very disordered, chaotic, boiling, crazy, and then in a nanosecond, it becomes perfectly coherent. And actually, it takes on almost magical properties. And it's called superfluidity in helium. Now, interestingly, they've done studies with people meditating in consciousness, where they would take, say, you have a town of 20,000 people, and you would put in 1% of that population, let's say 200 people. And they would be there for a week or two just meditating and doing conscious coherence. They would find ER visits would go down, violent crimes would go down, all kinds of negative behaviors in society would go down, even though no one in that town knew those people were there. So it wasn't because they knew they were there. So there is this non-local, we call it, effect through field consciousness, that it becomes very powerful at around that 1% point. So what does that mean? In America, we have 330 million people. If there were 3.3 million people who understood this principle and practiced meditation, but also followed it up with intent, action, that would be adequate to shift the other 99%. And the US being the biggest economy and the most powerful superstate military, that would be profound. So I tell people, a lot of people are very hopeless. I'm not. I'm extremely optimistic that this can be achieved, but there's a certain number of human citizens that need to accept responsibility, come together, and do something productive in this space of conscious development, spirituality. And by spirituality, I mean the essence of the spirit of pure consciousness and enlightenment, as opposed to religiosity and the catechisms of organized religion. Those are often diametrically opposed to spirituality, unfortunately. But that's my assessment, having studied every world religion and organization. But what I mean is that everyone has the ability to do this. And that's one of the reasons why, to be honest with you, I mean, I don't say this often, but I think you'll understand where I'm coming from. The reason we moved this Close Encounters of the Fifth movie out so quickly and are pushing it out to millions and millions of people, my goal is within the next 12 months, about 1 billion people will see it. Because if 1 billion people will see it, some small percentage of them might actually get it and start practicing the meditations, understanding their coherence, but also come together in groups to do it. And when that happens, you will see at that 1%, maybe before, depends on how powerful people's meditative states are, you'll see this shift in society. So I don't think it's going to happen from external activity so much as what we can do by understanding the leveraging effect and the power of this infinite conscious field that is within. It's like a conscious quantum hologram. It's folded within every single individual. And it was like this expression, think it's thyself a puny form when within the universe is folded. It's a great old quote, it's old English, but in reality, the entirety of creation is folded within the structure of the conscious field. And people say, I said, just stop and think for a moment. If you're hearing my voice right now, how are you awake and hearing it? That's all it is. It's just the faculty. It's not what you're conscious of. It's the conscious field itself. It's so close to us. It's been likened to, it's closer to us than our life's vein. We don't even notice it. But that's why the quieting of the mind and the going into deep, quiet mind. And then all of a sudden you find yourself expanded, and you find yourself able to see remote places or engage, let the ocean of pure consciousness become the drop of your individual self. So the drop merges with the ocean. But the people are afraid of that because they think, I'm going to lose myself. No, yourself is always there. It's about this ability to have yourself become resonantly aligned with that unbounded field of awareness. And when people begin to experience that in a certain critical number, and it doesn't mean, like full on samadhi enlightenment, but just in some way, and they've done this with many experiments, this 1% effect, it transforms everything around them. So this is something that everyone can do, and it needs to happen at the same time we're disclosing this information and technologies and sciences. They need to go together hand in hand in order for there to be an enlightened disclosure of the information and the sciences and technology.
Well, 2 points. One of them is, one of my personal observations is that internal to myself, I'm still the same spark of life that's in me, that has been in there since I was a 4 or 5-year-old child and became aware of it. That spark has not changed. It has not aged. It has been on this journey progressing through this life. Right. As this meat suit that I wear ages. Okay, that has been the constant. It is in there. It is forever. That is my proof that we are part of this conscious universe. That we have this immortal spark within us.
Yes.
The other thing that concerns me, though, is that we're going to get opposition from the organized religions, who are going to say, no, that's not the way. We are the way. You have to follow us. You follow our dogma. You have to have faith. We can't prove anything, but have faith in this, whatever the nonsense of the day is. And so it's.
But I was at the Vatican, and I was meeting with the Pope's senior theologian, Monsignor Balducci, and I'm at his quarters overlooking St. Peter's, and we had this discussion, and there wasn't tissue paper between us. There was no separation in our views. He actually completely accepted everything we've just been saying. So I think that even in the most hidebound religious orthodox orders, it's a process of education. It's a process of sharing. And what I have found in meeting with a number of people from all walks of life is that people really are ready for that, but it has to be articulated. It has to be made universal, so it doesn't become a shtick of this cult or that cult or this, whatever it is, or this organized religion or this thing. And this is the real hard part of it. The reason I've kept my own operation very decentralized is that I want everyone to be empowered to be their own force as a team, making contact with these civilizations, but also in sharing. I'm very, very suspicious in top-down structures around spirituality and hierarchies because they inevitably get corrupted. Now, it doesn't mean that they're not educable. They are educable. So when I've had meetings with people at that level in various organizations, I found that they're actually much more open. And even in what I call the cult of conventional scientific orthodoxy, and they can be just as fanatical as religious people, by the way, saying so as a doctor and a scientist. But, you know, when I had this meeting with the CIA director, he was sort of a functionary, but his wife was the chief operating officer of the National Academy of Sciences. And she was at the meeting with my wife and our host and his wife. So she asked me, very interesting. He didn't, the director of the CIA didn't even think to ask it, but she looked at me, she says, how are they communicating across the vastness of interstellar space? And I'm a young doctor, and I'm thinking, oh God, do I tell her the truth and lose all credibility? No, really, this is what's going through my mind.
I understand that.
Or I mean, this is the freaking CIA director, right? Or do I tell her something that's some scientific sounding pablum about black holes and bullshit? And I go, no, I'm going to tell her the truth. So I told her, I said, at the speed of light, 1% of the distance through our own Milky Way galaxy, which is one of trillions of galaxies, that's 100,000 light years across as our galaxy. 1% of the way is 1,000 light years. And 1,000 light years, it means a electromagnetic signal from your phone or anything else.
It took 100,000 years to get
1,000 years to get there, and it would be another 1,000 years to get the answer back. So it's the time since the birth of Christ to say, hey, how you doing? Oh, I'm doing fine, honey. That's how long that conversation took, is 2,000 Earth years. So what I told her is that the speed of light is too damn slow. So we're dealing with civilizations that understand the science of consciousness, the technological interface with thought and consciousness, and they have devices as well as innate capabilities to interact at the level of the conscious field, which is non-local and not limited by the speed of light, as well as thought, which the quanta of thought are instantaneous. And she looked at me, and I thought she was going to laugh me under the table. We were having dinner at this home, surrounded by Secret Service. And she looks at me and she says, I thought it had to be something like that. Now think about that. This is 93. This is why I'm very optimistic that there are a lot of people in society who are ready to hear this information and do something with it. That even though it's not, see, the mainstream media will take all this stuff and just ridicule it. But in reality, people in very high places in religion and government and science, I have meetings with people like that virtually every week. And I find that they are very on board. The problem is everyone's afraid of being ridiculed. We're all kindergartners afraid of ridicule. So, you know, I'm one of these strange characters. I really don't care if someone makes fun of me. It's fine. And I'm very thick-skinned about it, and they can call me any name they want, and I couldn't care less. But most people who are in these high positions in society, they're looking around to say, oh, am I going to be ridiculed? Is the New York Times, working on behalf of the agency, going to write a thing about I'm Senator Moonbeam or something and make fun? So what I find is that the higher up in society you go, the more those people, even though they're completely on board with everything you and I are saying, they're terrified of
taking risk.
Reputations being sullied by the media attacking them like a pack of hyenas. And so I have compassion. Actually, I've had enough meetings at that level where I really understand what they're afraid of, because, you know, I was never had any official position anywhere. And, you know, an emergency doctor rattling around, taking care of trauma and stuff. But I mean, I wasn't like some big official at some government agency or a senator or whatever. So I'm not excusing their cowardice, because that's what it is. I'm not excusing the cowardice, but I compassionately understand it. But those of us who are ordinary people like myself, we can do this. Interestingly, I had the head of Army Intelligence say to me, you're lucky because you're free. You can do these things and we can't. So I tell the public, you don't know how lucky you are, because you're actually not in a position where your whole life and career could go into ashes. because you step out of the box that they want us to stay in. And this, I tell people, thank God for that. And so that's why I guess I'm very Jeffersonian in the sense of we the people. I kind of feel like we the people have to embrace our own power and not expect the elites to do it. The elite, and by the way, there has been no big progress in human history that was led by the centers of power. It always came from left field. It always came from the fringes, always. So I tell people we're in good company as pioneers in consciousness and space and a new civilization, and to embrace that. Don't be afraid of it, and be thankful that we are pioneers and can be free to do it.
Well, let me ask you a question, because you just referenced something. This is a little, you say that these extraterrestrial civilizations have access to consciousness enhancing technologies, or that they can use. And we also talked about that there are repressed technologies that have not been released.
Yes.
Are you aware of any consciousness enhancing technologies that have been developed by our government or by other contractors, if you will?
Oh, yes. I mean, in fact, in the early 90s, when I first emerged at that level of dealing with people like the head of Army intelligence and people like that, I was had a man who had been an early electronics genius in 1950s, when I was probably a twinkle in my father's eye, who had developed an electronic headset that actually was eventually bought by a front company for the CIA, that you could put on, and it was electronic, but it would enable people to get into a state of consciousness to seamlessly see with consciousness remote places. So it was an electronic consciousness assist program. And I think that he had it pretty well perfected in 1956, 57. So those have been studied. The other thing I've been briefed on, I have a man on my team who was in the old Murray Hill Bell Labs facility working on, it was a sphere that looked like about the size of a soccer ball, maybe a little bigger, that was this very complex metallic sphere that had come from an extraterrestrial vehicle that we had downed with our electronic warfare systems. And this was a communication device, but it turned out it was a communication system that could interface with thought and consciousness. And the people in the lab, this is a true story. This sounds like something out of Twilight Zone or the X-Files, but it's 100% true story. This device communicated mentally in thought to the scientists, and the ETs knew that the general overseeing this device wanted to figure out how it worked, but for very bad reasons, for very weaponized reasons. And the device started sending messages to the scientists saying that this is what will happen, please destroy me. So they put this device in some kind of powerful electronic, like a microwave type system, and basically hit the button, and it sort of, the very last thing the scientists heard coming out of the ooze was, thank you. But it was all mentally, they all heard it. Now, of course, the general was furious. The cover story was they accidentally hit the wrong button and destroyed this thing. Now, you know, I have the full particulars on the place and the people there, but what I'm saying is that, yes, so this has been a subject of, you know, there's been the energy and propulsion research. The part of the research that has not been talked about much in these circles is the work that's been done on consciousness, electronics, and devices that interface. And the ETs have two type of systems. One I call, they're sort of reverse versions of each other. One is technology assisted consciousness. So that would be like this device, a technology that assists your own consciousness at seeing or projecting thought or doing something remotely. And then there's the reverse. There's consciousness assisted technologies where, like, the occupants of these interstellar vehicles, their bioelectric and conscious field will interface with the navigation and guidance systems directly. So the consciousness is interfacing with that technology. So there, I call it TAC and CAT, is technology assisted consciousness, and then the reverse is consciousness assisting technologies. And those technologies are very intrinsic to any interstellar civilization, because by definition, a priori, if you are interstellar, you have to go beyond the speed of light. When you cross the resonant field frequency of matter, light, atoms, what have you, you have crossed into these dimensions that are increasingly conscious and thought realms. And the mystics used to call them astral, like your body of light when you have an out-of-body experience, or when I was 17, I died and had a near-death experience. So what I tell people is that that is actually scientifically reproducible. And so the advanced civilizations that we're dealing with and making contact with through our CE5 contact teams, that's why we're using all these concepts, because that's their central operating system, just like ours is electromagnetism and cell phones and all that. Theirs is this next level over. And I think, you know, unfortunately, by the time you and I were born, this was all understood. And we've been living for 2/3 of a century in this sort of blackout of science and information. And unfortunately, that means we've all been miseducated by having this knowledge withheld from us. And that has held back human evolution.
I would use the term mal-educated.
Yes.
Mal-educated. We've been, you know, educated to our own self-destruction. So it's there's bad intent behind it. Mis indicates an ineptitude. Mal indicates a bad intention. So
bad intention.
Been mal-educated
it is a bad intent. Yes, you're correct. 100% correct. Yeah.
So, but you know, where do we go from here? How do we inspire people to take a look? You know, we can't make anyone do anything. They have to choose to do this. They have to choose to want to participate. They choose to want a part of it.
Right.
How do we attract the horse to water, so to speak? How do we get people to want to try this? You know, I mean, I am on fire with this. I have been since I was a little kid. I wanted to get into space, explore the greater universe. But not everybody is so motivated, and we're swimming against a strong upstream current coming from the bad guys who want to hold us down. So
remember, we only need that 1%. So here's the point. Remember that at that 1% point of conscious awareness and action and intent, everything shifts. This is this whole morphogenic field concept Rupert Sheldrake talks about. So I think that the 100th monkey effect. So I think that's very important, because if we have to remember, this is not an election where you need 51% of the vote. All right. We don't have to get 51%. We have to get that 1% or so. But to do that is completely doable through network and social media, trying to find people who are supportive. And I tell people, if you're curious about this, the sort of the background for disclosing this information, I did a documentary that came out 3 years ago. It's still on Netflix. It's called Unacknowledged. And it's had about 650 million people see it globally. The next one that came out just recently is Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind. Those two documentaries are sort of primers that would bring anyone up to speed. And then the next thing would be to practice what's in the app, where it goes through the process of meditation, but then connect with people of like mind. I think one of the problems is people feel very isolated. So the reason we came out with this new app is that it has a feature where it has a map built into it, where you can see who is in your region or state or whatever, or if you're traveling, who's interested in this, so that you can hook up with them, like a dating app, except it's not for dating. Well, it might be. I don't know. People do. Not TMI. I don't want to know. But you know, but you can use it to find other people, like-minded people, and form groups to study this issue, to go out under the stars and make contact. And it's really exciting. And now, you know, we have like 100,000 people around the world doing this. So what we need to do is that we need about 3 million people in America doing it, and about 80 million people globally, which would be 1% of the 8 billion. And that's a big jump. but that's why I'm trying. Well, a lot of people are wondering why I've suddenly pivoted from doing all this stuff in classified briefings for people, you know, as a sort of pro bono thing I was doing, to doing these feature films. I think we've got to reach mass consciousness. But remember, we're blacklisted. What I'm doing is blacklisted by the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN. So the only way we're getting the word out through this is through folks like you, thank you, your followers who are listening to your show. There are others, so like Demi Lovato, who's a very well-known singer, just tweeted out about. So we've got to figure out how to network this to bypass the fascist grip that the mainstream media is in, the death grip of these fascist totalitarian sociopaths. And the only way I can see around it, thank goodness, we still have the internet, we still have social media, we have networking. So I think people have to understand that it needs to be person to person, heart to heart. But with the internet and social media, we can reach, you know, 10 years ago, I couldn't have done what I'm doing now. There wasn't even YouTube barely functioning. Now we can reach millions and hundreds of millions of people. So that's what we need to look. We have to look at strategies where my view of this is we need to be like clear water going down the stream. And if there's a big boulder in front of it, we move around it or over it or under it or around it. We have to just keep moving, because the cabal of people who want to keep all this stuff secret and keep us, frankly, spiritually and technologically retarded, will do everything they can to throw a boulder up. That's what I've been dealing with for 30 years. It's rather exhausting, to be honest with you. The only person who knows what that's been like is my wife, who we're about to have our 41st anniversary. But it's like, it's very difficult. But what I find is that the public, I have great faith that the public can understand these things. I believe people innately can understand these subject matter, but also the concepts and the practice and consciousness better than we give them credit. I think there's, they did a study with Noetic Sciences years ago with Edgar Mitchell, who I sort of mentored on this subject. I took him to the briefing I did for Admiral Wilson, the head of intelligence for the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And his organization commissioned a study that found that 25% of the United States population were called cultural creatives, meaning they were interested in consciousness, meditation, new thought. That's 75 million people. So we need to be able to find ways to network with those folks, because I think there are a lot of people who are honestly quite ready for this knowledge and information. What they need is also instructional. Okay, I understand this intellectually. Now what do I do? But imagine if millions of people started going out under the stars in this meditative state, connecting to these interstellar civilizations in consciousness and thought, the effect that would have in your community, but also cosmically. It's the power of that. I can't even begin to express how powerful that is. And people need to understand that is the innate power of humans coming together in a positive way. Usually we're all united when there's 9/11 or a riot or something negative or a new war. I'm saying we need to find a way to come together in a way that's exciting, that is motivating for something that's beautiful and positive. And that's why, frankly, I'm trying to put this information and tools out to the best that I have the ability to do. Again, remember, we have no corporate funding or support. This documentary, I want to thank, if there's anyone listening who contributed, was crowdfunded. So we just asked for donations. And we also didn't have, the distributor doesn't pay any money to get the word out, to do marketing or anything. We had to do all that. So, and that cost us $200,000. So I tell people, you know, this doesn't happen just by a Ouija board wiggling your nose. You've got to organize, and that, but thank goodness we've had about 5,000 people, almost 5,000 people, donate to the movie and the getting the word out on it. We call it the 1% campaign. And if people can go to ce5film.com and can see what we're doing with crowdfunding. And there are all kinds of incentive gifts you get when you contribute. And the donations have been from $3 to $101,000 so far. We've raised about $866,000. so far for the production of the movie and its marketing and distribution. Now, that's not a big budget. I mean, obviously, big Hollywood films, a small project is $5 million, but it's what we can do now. But we can multiply the effect of it by word of mouth and through social media. So I think people need to take it upon themselves to organize themselves as CE5 contact ambassadors. And I tell people, there used to be, Carol and I used to talk about, there was this organization, Physicians for Social Responsibility, in the 70s and 80s that were doctors who went over to the Soviet Union to create a rapprochement and a dialogue in the darkest days of the Cold War. Well, now we need citizen ambassadors from Earth to these other civilizations, but understanding that their paradigm of communication isn't knocking on your door or necessary. We have to understand the paradigm of an interstellar civilization going beyond the speed of light through other dimensions, and the phenomenon that accompanies that, which we don't go too far into in this movie because you can only cover so much in 2 hours, is gone into more in the app, the training app, because there's all kinds of unusual phenomena that happen.
For instance, what specifically?
Well, here's a great example. One time we were up in the mountains in California at the base of Mount Shasta, and we were doing the remote viewing and the meditation. And there was an object that was seen up near the peak that was a spherical diamond light that appeared and then vanished. The next thing is that everyone heard, kind of like a neurophone in their consciousness, but not just one or two psychics, everybody heard this tone that we actually recorded with a tape recorder that came through and over the circle. But as it moved over the circle, and it was this very complex cosmic tone, everyone in their mind's eye saw a spherical object, a sort of gunmetal gray spherical object, silvery, that they could see in their mind, but wasn't visible to the naked eye, that floated right over us. And everyone had the same image. Now, this is very unusual, but we did get the recording of the tone. So there's all kinds of phenomenon that accompanies a true interstellar transdimensional vehicle and its occupants that doesn't make sense until you begin to get educated on, they are not using 20th century Earth technologies, right? By definition. So we have to get educated on the phenomenon that is of extraterrestrial origin, as opposed to the phenomenon that we see that could be a covert Lockheed Skunk Works device. So this discernment is very, very important. Unfortunately, with COVID, I haven't been allowed to do any expeditions with groups of people, which I wanted to do this spring and summer and fall. But people can begin to experiment with this on their own. And we've tried to put enough information in the training app, the CE5 Contact app, so that people can actually have enough fund of knowledge and instruction to kind of know what's going on. But ultimately, I need to do a more thorough, I probably need to do a more thorough online course. Like, I do these week-long expeditions, so I need to do a week-long version of it because, well, who knows? I could be dropped dead any day, for one thing. But for another, I could be killed. And for another is that now we're all being locked away in, under house arrest virtually, with whatever the next concocted threat is that they come up with. By the way, one of the things that concerns me about this COVID is that it seems to be a beta test of how far they can control the populace.
Yes. How compliant will they be?
Kind of irrational edict coming from a state, local, or federal authority, whether or not it makes any scientific sense at all. There's this a fascinating guy named Tony Robbins who put together a team of Nobel Prize winning scientists and doctors and what have you. And one of them, Dr. Levitt, made the comment that the response to this has been, quote, anti-scientific. This is a Nobel Prize winning scientist. And so, one of the things that has concerned me from March until now, or February, and by the way, the people at the Army Biowarfare in Fort Detrick have all told me they knew about this thing in December. Everyone knew about it. So in March, when they shut down society, and what happened is that people are doing things without any scientific basis or knowledge, but they're just going, yes. So everyone's, unfortunately, they're not questioning authority, which is, I think people must do, but they are also become sort of sheeple that whatever everyone's doing, I'm going to do it. And I think that's a way that the this sort of super state, this covert group is trying to see how far can we control the populace, and will they go along with any anti-scientific thing that sounds scientific but is not, and it sounds rational but it isn't, while we don't do anything meaningful to contain the outbreak. For example, a lot of people don't know this. If you are under age 70, the risk of death from COVID is 0.04%, about the same as the flu. Now, the elderly population with comorbidities, very high risk, and this virus spreads at 2 or 3 times the rate of the flu. But instead of putting a hermetically sealed protection and support around the high risk population, we tried to lock down all of society, but left the high risk population semi-permeable, we'd say in science, which meant that we had half the deaths in America have been in nursing homes and places, because we didn't do the things to protect the most vulnerable, while at the same time spending trillions controlling all the others. So one of the problems is that if you were to do, I call this murder by bureaucrat, if you were to write a script for ensuring the maximum number of deaths and the least effective thing to do, it would be what we've been doing, frankly. As a doctor, I'm telling you this. On the other hand, what's being left out with the myopia of academics and government bureaucrats is that the number of deaths related to the lockdown, cancer deaths, opioid overdoses, suicides, people not getting cancer screening, people not coming in for heart attacks, strokes, is about 5 to 10 times the number of COVID deaths. This is a fact. The UN even is admitting that globally at least 100 million people are going to die due to how we responded to the virus, not the virus. So this is one of these things that if you're actually a public health person concerned about the public health, you wouldn't just look at one metric, COVID deaths amongst the elderly. You would look at all of it and make a rational series of risk-benefit decisions that would be rational. That didn't happen from December until March, or even till now. And you have to ask the question, why? One of my concerns is that people just going on almost a Pavlovian sort of knee-jerk response is going on automatically with what authority figures are saying, are kind of a test to see when they roll out this alien threat. And I've talked to Carol Rosin about this, is this is sort of a test to see how far can we actually brainwash the public to do things that are anti-scientific, anti-rational, ineffective, but everyone goes along with it. And, you know, there have been some of the social media sites that have said, if you state anything on the site that contradicts what the World Health Organization is saying, we will ban your site.
Well, 2 questions everyone should ask anytime there's something like this is, who benefits, why now?
Yes,
those
correct.
Those are two fundamental questions everyone should ask themselves. And the answers will appear most evident to most people.
Yes.
Now, my next question for you is, how many distinct interstellar civilizations have you had contact or communicated with?
It's in the dozens, perhaps hundreds. You know, remember, I've been doing this with teams for 30 years. And what's interesting, in the last 3 or 4 years, there are civilizations that have appeared with their craft and beings. You know, there are a couple of really interesting photos in this documentary, one of which is this triangular shaped head being that healed this. There was an elderly man who had had a hearing loss since he was a child, and that ET being eventually healed his hearing. But we have a photo of this being. But some of these civilizations are just now being introduced to humans through CE5 contact teams. And so the number is growing. So it's not a static number. I know that people who worked on the NBC teams, what are, you know, the biological and chemical, nuclear, biological, chemical containment teams, that was one of the covers for ET spacecraft retrieval, where they retrieve the bodies and the craft. One of the members of this team said that back in the, I think it was the late 60s, they had documented around 60 different civilizations. I'm quite sure it's much, much higher than that. They appear to all know each other and be working together, in fact, and they have different specialized functions. But one of them is very involved with security, cosmic level security. And for example, Colonel Dietrich, who is the head of the old Atomic Energy Commission division dealing with nuclear weapons facilities, that then became, you know, the current nuclear agency. He, in an interview we have, and it's on our YouTube channel, stated that every single nuclear weapons facility, processing plant, missile silo, etc., had been surveyed and also overflown and had reconnaissance by these ET spacecraft, because they're very concerned that these weapons could not only lead to the extinction of all life on Earth if used on a large scale basis, but also they had begun doing some ridiculous experiments. For example, one of them was that they fired, they adapted an ICBM, intercontinental ballistic missile, and fired it to the moon. And they were going to detonate it on the moon. Well, the ETs, as that missile went exo-atmospheric, left the atmosphere, the ETs took it and neutralized it. Now, this, what I just described, is a factual account from an eyewitness, a person, a colonel who was involved. And I have and I have other people who've been involved with similar events. If you look at Professor Jacobs' testimony, who's one of our Disclosure Project witnesses, there was a test out of Vandenberg Air Force Base where they sent a ICBM up, and it got intercepted as it went exo-atmospheric, and the ET craft came around and with some sort of laser or some kind of thing just basically neutralized it. Now, if you are in the National Military Command Center and you hear this report, you're going to think, oh, these ETs are hostile. They weren't hostile to humans. They're hostile to us putting weapons of mass destruction in or through space, or targeting a celestial body, even our own moon, which, by the way, has had ET facilities on it. So I think that this is what people need to understand. There's a lot of, excuse my language, but sort of a pissing contest with some of the people who've been involved in these covert programs and large weapon systems. And there are ETs that are going, you're not doing this. We're not going to permit this kind of weaponization of space, or at least the detonation of these weapons out here. So that, if you understand, if you've ever worked with some of these guys, they're not used to being told no. They get their way and they do what they damn well wish. So you have a conflict that is completely resolvable, but it has to have a different consciousness brought to it, and also a different understanding. Because what they did with Ronald Reagan, and I suspect they've done this with Donald Trump as well, is that they brought people in who presented false information about the alien threat, which is why Ronald Reagan, it's in our documentary, Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind, where he says, you know, wouldn't my job of creating world unity be easier if we had a common alien threat to unite against? I ended up interviewing a Colonel Holman, who was on a committee for SDI, Star Wars, putting, you know, these weapons in space, back in the Reagan era, who he actually tried to pitch that program to Jimmy Carter. Carter wouldn't bite. They pitched it to uh, Reagan, he accepted it because they told him about these things that had happened where the ETs had neutralized some of our nuclear assets when we'd fired them out into space. Well, Reagan, of course, was manipulated then into accepting and expanding the Star Wars, as it was called, Strategic Defense Initiative assets into space. And I think a similar sort of pincer movement of disinformation and spin happened around Donald Trump, where he then, went along with doing the Space Force and then accepting that we need to have more weapons placed in space and on satellites in space, et cetera, which of course is a very dangerous thing because it's not being done in just the conditions of normal geopolitical Earth, China, Russia, US. We have extraterrestrial civilizations out there who are going, this is not a good idea. And the other part of this that people don't understand is that a lot of these assets that already do exist on satellites or satellite-based weapons, those satellites are piggybacking what are called scalar or longitudinal electromagnetic weapons that are targeting ET craft in our solar system or in our atmosphere and knocking them down. You hear about all these various retrieved ET craft that we've been working on, including, I might point out, the New York Times reported this week, the fact that there's material not of this world. I'm quoting from the New York Times and this scientist and a national security guy that's in the article. But people go, where do they get those? Do they just come from interstellar and can't guide their way around a thunderstorm in New Mexico? No. Those have all been electromagnetic warfare systems that began to be experimented with in the 30s and 40s. But by 1947, when Roswell happened, we had one that was effective enough that when these 3 ET craft were checking out our nuclear weapons storage area at Roswell, it was the only place in the world where we had nuclear weapons at the time, the 509th Bomber Squadron there, they switched that system on and those 3 craft collided and lost control and went down. A lot of people don't know that was an early, quote, Star Wars hit, but it was ground-based. Now they put those systems, beginning in 1965, they put those systems on satellite and platforms in space and have been targeting these objects. Well, this is an existential threat to world peace. And I pointed this out to Boutros Ghali, the UN Secretary General back in the 90s. And of course, they're appalled. But of course, those are unacknowledged special access projects, I mean, deep black. Very few people are read into them. And this is one of the problems when democracy and oversight breaks down, what Eisenhower warned us about. That kind of secrecy can get so out of control that we then have a situation where there are people doing extremely risky, dangerous things that puts everyone on Earth at risk for no good reason. And no one's overseeing them. No one's controlling what they're doing, which is why, getting back to this discussion, it's incumbent upon the citizenry to get informed on this subject and become ambassadors to these civilizations so that we show them another side of humanity that isn't warmongering and violent and frankly stupid. And so I think this is where every individual has this as sort of a sacred obligation. And I don't often say this, but since you've worked in these areas or your show must have a lot of veterans that listen, I assume. I'm very concerned. When I was at the Pentagon briefing, the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, General Patrick Hughes, a 3-star, he had been denied access to those operations. And I came in with a whole portfolio of documents and testimony and pictures. And he was very upset. And he went over to his bookcase at the Pentagon. This was at the Pentagon. It was a stand-up brief in the general's conference room. And he got a little ET doll like you'd get at a toy store. And he was furious. And he grabbed it and said, "This is all I've gotten from my inquiries into this subject through the chain of command. Now, this is the director of the Defense Intelligence Agency. Google it, those of you listening. It's the biggest intelligence gathering entity for the Pentagon. It's the CIA for the Pentagon. It's the military version. So, and this was the director. So, the reason I had the meeting was that he had heard through whispers that we had these killer weapon systems in space on satellites. He didn't understand what they were being used for because he had heard they were not pointing down to Earth, they were pointing out into space. And so I came in and informed him, and he, of course, he was very upset because he realized this is an existential threat to our planet. Not because the ETs are hostile, but because we have people trying to provoke, sort of an agent provocateur, it used to be called. They're trying to be agents of provocation with these civilizations. And that's very dangerous. Now, luckily, these ET civilizations have exercised a Gandhian level of restraint and have not struck back. They have neutralized things we put out there that were a threat to them, but they have not struck back. And I always tell people, all the lunatic fringe of the UFO subculture, which is most of it, I hate to admit, that if these civilizations were hostile, it would have been point, set, match, over in 1945 when we detonated the first atomic weapon at the Trinity site.
Well, two data points for you. One of them is it was JFK who wanted to break the CIA into 1,000 pieces.
Yes.
And it was JFK who founded the DIA. Yes. To replace them. And right. So you've had these competitive organizations both trying to serve their own agendas. And one agenda is for the benefit of the country, and the other agenda, the CIA is essentially turned into an enemy of the people of Earth and particularly of this country itself. They have gone to the dark side completely, as far as I can tell.
Well, I mean, on this level, the unacknowledged special access level, and then one of the problems that I always point out is when you take these vast bureaucracies, everyone, have these sweeping, grandiose conspiracy theories, and they're always wrong. Wrong, wrong, wrong. The vast majority of people, whether it's in the Pentagon or the CIA even, the NSA, they are not read into an unacknowledged special access project. A special access project is one thing. A top secret TSSCI, top secret special compartmented information is one thing. But when it's an unacknowledged special access project, meaning it is completely not acknowledged to anyone who is not in that silo, who is not in that compartment, that is a horse of a different color. And so when you get to that level, and I have dealt with hundreds, I now have over 980 men and women who've been in USAPs, in corporate and CIA and Pentagon, here and abroad, that I have briefed, have information from. What I tell people is that some of them, I'll give you an example. There was a man who recently surfaced who had been in the sub-basement of the Pentagon in what's called the TMO, Technology Management Office. And he was read into, he was one of a few people, I think 5 people, that had what's called baseline clearance across 18 unacknowledged special access projects. And if people want to find out more about that, there's a documentary called Unacknowledged. You can see it on Netflix or on any site. But what's interesting is that he had been a career Army guy. He left the Army, became a civilian, and he was then pulled in to this unacknowledged special access project. And he said his entire career, he had never heard of an unacknowledged special access. He didn't even know they existed. So I think that there is, a lot of people don't realize this architecture, let's call it, the structure of these secret programs. They are extremely sophisticated. It's not like every Tom, Dick, and Harry with a top secret clearance knows about it. And that includes the CIA or the DIA or whatever. So it's a very, very compartmented operations. And of course, lethal force has been used to enforce secrecy around those operations. So luckily, all the people working with me are under an umbrella of protection. which means that we have extended a force directive so that anyone who comes forward is protected. And since 1998, 22 years, no one who has come forward to my group has ever been harassed, called, threatened, nothing. And I'm not going to say why. I will just tell you it is effective.
One other thing that people overlook is that a lot of these technology development programs have been embedded into private corporations. They may be publicly traded, and they're completely free of government oversight there.
Correct.
And the board of directors may not even know about it. But they're in these corporations. They've got a mandate. They're going forward with it, and these things are happening. And there's, like you said, no oversight, no control, no nothing. They're out there on their own doing what they will, with impunity.
That's right. And well, that's what happened with the Lockheed Skunk Works.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we have a letter. I don't know if you know who Ben Rich was. He was the director of the Lockheed Skunk Works.
Yes, I know who he was. Yeah, these guys said we now have the ability to take ET home.
Yeah, but I have a handwritten letter from him to one of his friends that I acquired through a contact, and it's in his handwriting. And he states, he said, and this is 1986. This is 34 years ago. And in the letter he states, and it's in this documentary, by the way, The Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind, and it states there are two types of UFOs: ours,
and theirs,
we're making, and ET. And this is in his handwriting, and he acknowledges it. So what I point out to people is that, but he called UFOs, quote, unfunded opportunities, because there were a lot of things he saw that could happen for the public, and it wasn't allowed. So Ben Rich and many of these people, but even Ben Rich as an administrator director was not read into all the compartments. So underground, in the underground facility out in the high desert out near Palmdale and Edwards, there's something called the Cube, which is the state-of-the-art Lockheed Skunk Works facility. I have an engineer who's worked in there. And of course, Northrop Grumman, my uncle's old company, have similar facilities. Boeing does, Raytheon. There are a number, EG&G. But I think what people have to understand is that those operations, if you approach them, if a government entity, like a government committee on the Congress, they'll say this is trade secrets. If a government entity tries to get in there, oh, it's a trade secret. If a private entity tries to go in, oh, it's classified government. So what they do, they play this sleight of hand, where no matter how you approach it, whether it's FOIA, a congressional inquiry, a public inquiry, they can morph like a chameleon or whatever, change colors, change whatever, and rationalize denying access. I know a guy who's one of the auditors with one of the big four auditing entities that was auditing my uncle's old company, Northrop Grumman. And he said basically what happened at a certain level of clearance, they just basically said, you have to accept our word for what we're doing here, because you don't have a need to know. This is beyond your... So a lot of the accounting that's done, they just rubber stamp it. It's whatever these corporations say they're doing. And as you know, one of our disclosure project witnesses had worked for Science Applications International Corporation, SAIC. And she testified to the fact that she was in an office that was sort of a storefront where millions of dollars came in. They would gin up fake reports to go back to the Congress and the Pentagon. And the money went through the back door into an unacknowledged special access project that was a black project. And she saw this and she's testified to it. So that kind of stuff goes on all the time.
It does. Well, let's we tell people where they can find your new documentary, and let's promote that. And then how can people get in touch with you and support you financially in any other way that you need? And finally, anytime you want to come on this show, you have open access. We
Okay,
will
great.
get you
Thank
back
you.
on. We will promote you. We will help you with this
Thank you.
cause any way humanly possible.
Thank you so much. Yeah, well, the unacknowledged, Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind documentary you can see on iTunes, Amazon, Google Play, all those sites. It's not yet on the free streaming sites. And then the app, the training app, you can get at the iTunes, the App Store and the Google Store. And it's called CE5 Contact is the name of it. And that will train people completely to be able to do these contact protocols. I tell people if they see the documentary Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind, it's going to show you a lot of the phenomenon and amazing things that have happened. And the reason we included so much footage and photographs from events from our teams where I wasn't there is that I want people to understand that what we're doing is not anything special to my abilities at all, that any conscious human being can do it. So my goal is to move this information and knowledge out so that I'm irrelevant, frankly. And the more irrelevant I am, the better off the world will be. So in terms of being able to go forward with or without me. So that is something everyone can do. We have a website called Sirius, SIRIUS Disclosure, Sirius like the star system or the radio channel, SiriusDisclosure.com. And it has all the information and links to our YouTube channel. We have like 70 top secret military people's testimony up there. And they can follow me on Twitter as @Dr. Stephen Greer. We also need help with more whistleblowers, people who have been in these projects coming forward, giving us information, documents, etc. And of course, we very much need funding support for people who want to go to contribute. You can go to ce5film.com and make a contribution. And there are different gifts people get, depending on their level of donation. So those are things people can do. I would say the number one for people to do is to get educated on the subject and just give this CE5 contact a try. People are shocked. We had I love telling this story. There was this guy, just a regular bloke who was a truck driver, lorry driver in Croatia. And he had got this app, the CE5 contact app, and he was doing it. So he pulled over up in the mountains and to take a rest at a pullout. And he was practicing it. And suddenly an ET craft materializes to his left. He writes it to our website to tell us this. And it materializes and floats across the cab of his truck. And then dematerializes. And he wrote us and said, this really works. I see it really does. And it wasn't like he had spent 20 years in an ashram doing yoga and all that. He just was doing this stuff. And I tell people we're having these kind of reports coming in from every country on Earth. Every country on Earth have teams doing this now. So if enough people do that, that will be the equivalent of a denial of service when you're doing a computer thing, where it will overwhelm the covert government's ability to suppress all this information because the ETs will respond. Now, they may respond in ways that you don't expect if it's not safe for them to be 3D, because a little caveat here, the more they're in full 3D, the more they can be struck, all right? Yeah. But they may do things where they're partially in this dimension, all kinds of strange phenomena. So people need to understand that at this time in history, the contact can be rather enigmatic in some sense, but there's a reason for it. You know, back in the 50s, before we had these weapons up on satellites, there were all these accounts of these things being fully 3D, landing here and here and here. That doesn't happen much anymore, because if they come into full 3D, they get hit with an electromagnetic weapon that's very powerful. So I tell people there are different ways to do this, but if millions of people, hundreds of thousands, and then millions of people start doing this, the covert programs can't be everywhere. They certainly, when I do something with a training group, they're there every time. All the covert, they're honest, like. So I tell people, in a sense, um, most people are going to be more successful and be freer to do this than I am, just because I'm on the radar screen as public enemy number one. David Marconi, who wrote Enemy of the State with Will Smith, he's on our team. He's the guy who took the photo of that ET with the triangular head that healed that man. And I said, oh no, that was an enemy of the state. I'm the enemy of the state. These guys hate me. Anyway, but you know, I tell people that's why if everyone does that, the best thing people can do is to actually walk the walk. Learn about this, go out there, don't be afraid. Do it with 3 or 4 people that you like. It doesn't have to be a huge crowd. It's better if it isn't. You can get more coherence in a group if it's a little smaller. And go out and try it. You'd be very, very surprised the kind of results you will have over time. And it isn't difficult at all to do. And it's innate to your ability as a conscious spiritual being to do it.
Well, in closing, I have had UFO sighting experiences myself. First time when I was like 8 or 9 years old.
Me too.
That 3 bright object thing that mattered. I have seen that several times in my lifetime. The first time I was 8 or 9 years old when I saw it.
Where was that?
It was in Missouri, St. Louis, Missouri, where I grew up. My cousin David and I were laying in my grandmother's backyard, just looking at the night sky. We both saw it. We saw all 3 of them. They all came together, formed a bright light, and disappeared. And it left a very indelible impression for me. I've never forgotten it.
I was about the same age when there was a full daytime materialized disc, seamless, that appeared in the afternoon where I grew up in Charlotte, North Carolina. That would have been in 1962 or 3 or 4 or something.
Yeah, something about that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Well, Stephen, thank you very much. And
thank you.
Again, give out information how people can get in touch with you if they want to help you in any way.
Sure. Our website, SiriusDisclosure.com, SIRIUS disclosure.com. And they can follow me on Twitter at Dr. Stephen Greer. And our YouTube channel is youtube.com/Dr. Stephen Greer. And they can follow us there. And at the website, if it's someone who is would want to help fund, they can go to ce5film.com and make a contribution, or through the website. If you're someone who has important information about some of these projects, who you want to get hold of me, there is a contact box on our website at SiriusDisclosure.com so that they can write in and contact me. Just keep in mind, we don't have, my wife and I do this whole project out of a corner of our living room, and we have no paid staff, no office, and we run completely on volunteers. So just be patient.
Well, Stephen, thank you so much, sir. Really appreciate your time. And
thank you.
This has been a very illuminating session here. Thank you so much. You're invited back anytime. So
great.
We're delighted to have you again.
We'll do it. Thanks so much.
Thank you, sir.
Bye.
Bye-bye.